Hey, welcome back. This is part 3 of the HTML, CSS, JavaScript crash course where we're trying to build this simple website. Right now, this is what we have. Not quite there, but we've got all the page structure. In this video, we're going to focus on cleaning it up, making it prettier, throwing some paint on it, shrinking this image down, absolutely, but also changing the background color, the font, the button needs a lot of work. If you can compare it to what we're trying to end up with. There's a lot of stuff to do. Also, making the image a circle. Okay, so CSS is what we're going to use to do that. And first things first, we need to open up the correct file in the starter code, which you can also download. If you haven't been following along, you can just download the current starter code that already has the HTML written. Open up app.css in whatever editor you're going to use. So I have it open here. There's already a line in here. I won't go into too much detail, but I just didn't want you to have to type this yourself. This is importing a font from a website called Google Fonts. We can't use all the fonts that you might want to use in the browser. So if there's one fancy font you definitely want, then this is one way of getting them, assuming that they are free. A lot of fonts aren't. But anyway, we're not going to go into that. This is here for you as starter code. This is how we write a comment in CSS. So if I go to this line and type command/, we're no longer importing that font, it's just there. Now let's dive into the real syntax. So CSS is all about styling HTML elements. So we have all these elements. We say things like, I want to make the H1s on this HTML page purple. And I want to make their font Helvetica and their font size 200 pixels. And I want to add a 1 pixel green border. We do that through CSS. So we specify what we're trying to style, and then we specify what the styles should be. If I go back to app.css, let's add in our very first rule. So we type the name of an element, a tag name like h1, and then curly braces. And I'm going to hit enter in between. Then inside of here, I add the actual properties I want to change. So if I had a note here, I'd say what we're selecting. Then inside of here, the note would be how to style it. So these are just notes again, they don't do anything. What we want to do, let's start by changing the color of that H1. And we just type color, and then you can see Sublime Text automatically added this semicolon. Every CSS property we style will end with that colon, or semicolon. So color, and let's go with purple, my favorite color. So we have a property name, purple, semicolon. Save the file, and unfortunately it's not going to work just yet because this HTML file has nothing to do with this CSS file. They're not speaking to one another. If you are using CodePen to follow along, you do not have to connect the files. That's one of the good things, but also a bad thing from an educator's point of view, is that you don't have to worry about that. But in the real world, you do. So the way we do it is through another HTML tag that we haven't seen. I'm going to put it in the head. So the body is where we put our content that shows up on the page, the actual elements, the structure of the page. The head is where we put metadata, things like the title of our document or a reference to a CSS file. So our CSS file is called app.css. It's in the same folder. The tag name we need is called a link tag. So I'm just going to type link and hit tab. And it auto-completes a bunch of this stuff. Link, and then this rel equals style sheet attribute, we won't worry about that. Type equals text.css, so we're linking to a CSS file. And then href. And href needs to be the path to find this file, which in our case is simply the name of the file, app.css. If you change the file name or if you're following along, name it whatever you want, but you need to refer to it using that name. And if it's in a subfolder, then reference that folder, whatever it is, /app.css or styles. That's a common way of structuring things. Okay, so we have app.css now. It is linked, and we are styling all H1s to be purple. We only happen to have one, but it would affect all of them. So if you save and refresh our page, see if you can see that, beautiful purple text. Excellent. Okay, so the rest of this video is just going to be us going through a couple properties at a time, styling the elements. And let's actually begin with the background color of the body. So the whole page has this salmon-y color. I'm going to select the body, which is where everything is inside of. So this will give everything a salmon background color if I select the body. And the property is called background-color. You can actually see in Sublime you get all this autocomplete. So background-color. And rather than typing one of the built-in colors like purple or yellow, I'm going to use a custom color using a hexadecimal code. If you don't know much about color, it's just a system for representing colors. And we're going to type F69680. 69680 and save. All right. And if we go back now, refresh, we get that salmon color. Next, let's finish out the styles with the body. So I'm going to give everything in the body a color. So I'm actually going to undo this color purple for now. I'll just comment it out, Command/. And instead, I'm going to assign color to the body. And what that will do is change the text color of everything inside of it. Unless we override it, unless I specify, no, H1 should actually be yellow. So color, and I have another hexadecimal code, and this is for a purple-ish color. So octothorpe, or whatever this is called, hash symbol 2E1263. Yes, I am reading that. Sorry for that awkward pause. Save now. Refresh our page. Notice right now, all the way down here, this is black text. Only the H1 was purple. But now the H1 is this purple-ish shade, and so is this text down here. Cool. Now let's finish up. We're going to change the font of everything in the body. We're going to do font family. And then we change it to the name of a font, which I've already imported up here for you. And the font is called Source Code Pro. That's coming from Google. So your computer most likely doesn't have this. The browser definitely won't have this. We have to include a custom font, which I didn't have you type. Save, add our semicolon. We need one of those after every property. And then go back, keep your eye on this H1 as I refresh. Awesome. So that is now a different font, as is this down here. So what we've seen, not only can we style specific elements like this, like a H1 or a button, but if we style a parent, like the body, and I say, okay, the body has a font of Source Code Pro and a background color of salmon, or a font color of purple, this had a font color of purple. This had a font color of purple. A button is a special case. I'll talk about why later. But what we've seen is something called inheritance, where the color is being inherited from the body style because we didn't specify anything for the H1. Next, if we do compare the font here to the font here, you can notice it's a lot thinner. This is way bolder. So there's a property that we can use to change that called font weight, font-weight, and we set it to a number. And I actually imported all different font weights if you want to use these. It's actually better to only import the ones you need, but if you'd like to experiment, we can say font weight is 200, semicolon. Refresh the page, and you'll notice that our H1 is still the same weight, but down at the bottom, the paragraph is lighter weight. That did change. So what happened? Well, without going into too much detail, if I right-click and go to Inspect in Chrome, and make sure I'm inspecting this H1. If we scroll down somewhere, here we go. These are the default styles that my browser assigns, and it gave it a font weight of bold. So you can see inherited from body, font weight 200 is crossed out. It's not being applied because my browser automatically gave it font weight of bold. It just decides that every H1 should be bold unless I specifically say it shouldn't be. So if I go back, I'm just going to copy this line, but instead add it to H1. This is more specific. This is going to override, and if I refresh now, that change takes effect. We don't have time in this video to go into a ton of detail about how all of this works, but every browser has default styles. That's how we saw that black and white text. That's how, the default button styles, for example, will look different in Safari compared to Chrome or Internet Explorer. And in our case, font weight was set to be bold. Now it's crossed out because I manually specified it for the H1. So there are rules that govern what styles apply when, if there's a conflict. Okay, I will close out of here now. Let's get this image shrunken down so I don't have to keep scrolling across this football field. To do that, we just select image tag. And I mentioned this earlier, when we write h1 here, this is applying to all h1s. It just happens that we only have one h1 on our page. But if we had more than one, all of them would be font weight 200. We only ever have one body on our page, but if for some reason you added two, then both of them would have these styles. So I'm going to type img for the image tag. And to set the width of the image, or the height, we can just pick one. I'll do height 500 pixels is the number that I decided on. And if I go back now and refresh, way better. And I just zoomed out to the actual size at 100%. This is what it looks like. So 500 pixels is not that large. That's great. Let's get it rounded now. So there's another property to make things round. You might be wondering where these properties are coming from. How do you know what is a property? If you go to MDN, just like in the last video, there's a CSS reference instead of HTML. And we scroll down. These are all the properties we can set. There's a lot. There's more properties than HTML tags. So there's things like background color, which we've worked with, background size, what else? Scroll behavior, alignment, letter spacing, display, direction, align content. There's just a bunch of things that we're not really going to get into. But if you ever have questions, you can come here. And the property we want to make the corners rounded is called border radius. And border radius, if we specify a small percentage, like 10%, and add that semicolon, if I refresh, you can see it rounds the corners a bit. But if we go 50%, at least on a square image, it gives us a circle. Okay, so that's that. We have a circle now. Let's finish up our H1. How do we get it to have this underline or overline? Actually, is what that is. And also notice it's all uppercase. And here, it's lowercase or it's mixed case, whatever you want to call that. And if we actually inspect the solution website, if you look at the HTML, it's not all in caps. So that's done through CSS. So how do we do that? If we go back to my editor, I'm going to go into the H1 styles, and instead of color purple, we'll delete that. Let's start by adding in a property called text transform and setting it to uppercase. This will take the text in there and uppercase it all. And while I'm here, I'm also going to add a border. And the syntax for border looks like this. We have 5 pixels or however many pixels wide we want the border, and then a style. We want it to be solid or dashed. I pretty much only use solid, but you could make a dotted border if you wanted to. And if I just do this, it's going to use the color of the H1, if I refresh, which is that purplish color, and it uses that by default. I could also specify a color like, what would work? Green, something easy to tell. Refresh, and it uses green. But if I don't specify anything, it just uses the color that's already there. But we don't want a border all the way around. We just want border top. Save and refresh. That gives us this top border. Now, as far as the positioning of everything, why this is all on the left and not in the middle, how do we change that? It's kind of a lot of work. CSS positioning is notoriously a pain. So there's entire courses actually on that. There are crash courses that are much longer than this, solely focused around positioning and layout and how do you get elements to go where you want them to go without too much pain. So what I'm going to do to kind of skip over that is just give you a couple lines of code to add that I'm not going to go into a ton of detail on. I apologize. I hate doing this, but it will make our life a lot easier and make this look a lot nicer with just a couple of lines. What I'm going to do is actually go back to my index, take all of this and wrap it in a new tag called a div tag. In a div, actually instead of a div, let's do a section tag. This is just an arbitrary wrapper for other HTML that allows me to group it together and do something with it. So I'm going to indent it all. You don't have to indent it. It's just a matter of style, making it look nicer to humans. A section tag, that's what I've done. And I'm going to give this an attribute called container. ID is the name of the attribute. I'm going to set it to container. This is just optional, but it's because I want to show you how to use an ID. An ID allows us to give a name, a label to an element that I could refer to in my CSS. So instead of typing section, if I'm going to style that, that will style all sections. It only happens that we have one, but if we had more than one, all of them would be styled. But if I reference container, and I have to use this symbol, that's what means it's an ID, and then the name of the ID container. Whatever I put in here only applies to that one element. If I move this ID to the H1, then the styles apply to this H1. If I move it to the button, they apply to that button. So in here, I'm just going to set a couple properties. I'm going to fast forward, and I'm back now. So this code, like I said, we're not going over in detail, but it serves to center the content vertically and horizontally. These two lines are responsible for that. It uses something called Flexbox, which I'm establishing that here. And here I'm telling it how much space to consider the playing field. So it's using 100% of that height and centering itself vertically in that 100%. But that's all I'll leave it at. And if we refresh the page, take a look at that. We're now centered vertically and horizontally. So I feel bad about having to do that, but like I said, we could spend forever just talking about how that works. It's pretty complicated compared to things like color. So next up, I'm going to make this bigger because if we look at my version, significantly bigger. To do that, we can use a property called font size. So back here for H1, I'm going to add font size, and there's a lot of units we can use. I'm going to stick with what most people are familiar with, px, pixels. Another common unit are called EMs, but I'm going to stick with pixels because this is a crash course. We don't have time for that. Save, refresh the page. There we go. So we're getting a lot closer. Let's start by tackling the button. So the button is a pain, and the reason it's a pain is that there's a bunch of built-in default styles that make it look like this. And we have to override a lot of properties, and we have to tell it, for example, to remove this ugly outline that we get. So there's a couple of things we just have to do. And we'll begin by selecting button. And where should we start? Let's set the background color. So we've already worked with that. And the background color should be that salmon-y color. So I'll just copy that and paste. Then let's change the font size to be 14 pixels. And let's also change the text align property so it's aligned to the center. And if I look at it now, okay, not much better. I'm going to make this bigger. You can see that background is now that salmon color, but we still have this hideous outline and a border. So I'm going to go back and I'm going to override the border, and I'm going to make it 1 pixel solid, and I'm going to use the same purple color we used for our text. Copy that down there. 1 pixel solid purple. Only 1 semicolon needed. Okay, so it changes that. And now I'm just going to run through a couple of other properties. I'm going to give it a text transform, again, make it all uppercase. You could just make your HTML uppercase, but this is nice if you want to do something stylistically, but you don't want to impact the HTML. And I also just think it's kind of cool to show you. I'm going to now change text decoration to be none and outline to be none. And that will take care of a lot of it. So now notice when I click on it, we actually don't get any feedback that I'm clicking on it. We will fix that by adding a little hover effect in just a bit. But this is getting closer. To take care of the size of the button, to make the button larger, to add the spacing here, and then also spacing afterwards, before and after, I'm going to just skip through these two properties very quickly. There's one called margin. I'm just going to type this here. This is one that you'll have to bear with me. I'm going to just kind of blow through it. Another one is called padding. All that I'll say is these both impact spacing. This is the space between the element and the border. So on the inside of that wall, the border, this is the space on the outside between other elements. And I refresh the page. You can see now that it has some space around the button. So that's the padding here in between the text and the border. And then we have space before and after, and that's the margin. And that's all I'll say about it because there's more to talk about there for another video. Okay, next, let's actually get this hovering effect to work. It's supposed to work like this. where I hover over it and it turns purple. And it's really easy to do that. We select button separately, :hover. And whatever styles I put here will only be applied when the button is hovered over. So what we want to do is make the background color purple. So instead of this pink, I'm going to use this. And then we want to make the regular color, the font color, salmon. So we're going to basically invert it. And if I refresh, there we go. But you'll notice there's a difference. This takes longer. I set the time to be 1/3 of a second, I believe, 0.3 seconds. This is happening instantaneously. To add that little time delay in, what we can do is go in here and add a property called transition. And transition, there's a lot to talk about with that. The simplest thing we can do is just type a number. Like if I do 3S for 3 seconds, this says any change to the button, whatever it is, background color, size, font, should take 3 seconds. That's too long for us, but just to show you, it now takes 3 seconds. I'm going to change it to somewhere around 0.3 seconds. And we get a just nicer effect. I'm also going to add in an underline, text decoration, underline. And I'm going to space out the letters a bit more using letter spacing. So this is not in the hover section. This is just on the button in general. And I'm going to do like 4 pixels between the letters. So if you look at them now and then I refresh, they're spaced out more. And there's this little underline that we get when I hover. Awesome. So looking at the two, the only remaining differences are if I zoom way in, this text is still black when it's not being hovered. So I need to change that color. And the font size is slightly off on the paragraph. It is larger if I zoom out. It's hard to tell, but it's a little bit larger. So on the button, I'm going to add in color and set that. I swear I already did that. Well, color now is going to be that purple color, and then we're not styling the paragraph anywhere. So down here, we'll just do P and then set the font size to be 20 pixels. Refresh. There we go. There's our website. At least stylistically, it's done. So this was a whirlwind. I want to be clear that we covered a lot, and there's no way if you're brand new to CSS that most of this would sink in. The key takeaways are, 1, the fact that CSS styles HTML elements. So there has to be an element there. We then select types of elements or a particular element using an ID. And then in the brackets, we use these pairs where we set a property and then a corresponding value. Font should be source code pro. Font weight should be 200. Text transform is uppercase. There's just tons and tons of properties we can use. We use a lot of them here, but we barely scratch the surface. So if you do feel overwhelmed, just keep in mind that the point of this course is to just expose you to all of this. If you had a typo, if it's going too fast for you at any point, I just recommend you explore the code, download the solution, and try changing numbers. See what happens if you do a smaller border radius, or you change the font weight or the colors or any of that stuff. All right, next we're going to talk about JavaScript.